Welcome to the Vidcast sampler of Nightfall, a collection of science fiction short stories set in the world of Dusk by Ashanti Luke. You can find out more about Dusk and Nightfall at www.ashantiluke.com. You can join my author page on Facebook or follow me on Twitter at Ashanti Luke. Dusk is currently available at all major e-bookstores. This vidcast of Nightfall contains violence and adult situations, and listener discretion is advised. Bahia by Ashanti Luke. This is how the world ends, not with a bang, but with samba beats and the smell of sweat and sex and charsival heavy in the thin Martian air. The Charshambe feast came early this year. All of the Quilombos gathered here after the strange auroras appeared in the evening sky and a world of dread began to spread over the planet. Life in the Quilombo of Charshambe and on Mars in general had always been hard, but in every Quilombo it was clear that along with the strange wavering in the night sky came an even stranger menace. People of the Quilombo of Bahia raised pigs for an entire year for the numerous dim sum trays for the feast, and it was always a long-awaited departure from the standard fare of protein and nutrient supplements. Even though the meat was a prized commodity, today the cornucopia flowed free. The smell of steamed pork buns and rolled chung fan filled the atmosphere around the Mons. Bonfires were normally prohibited on the surface. Burning the Martian air was like burning food during a famine, but this night we needed to keep the sun alive, so they allowed the flames to reach out to the faltering heavens. The music tonight was especially lively. I never participated in the dances, or in the hardo circles that formed around dancers, and the Malando combatants as the samba beats and horn tones rose high in the artificial atmosphere. Martian history, like Martian life, had always been so rich, and I had always stood outside of it as an observer, a wayward hitchhiker simply passing through each Quilombo like a faint apparition. Outside the archaeology of sciences, Mars was much less sterile, more gritty. Life in the archaeology had been easier, but I heard the dread had hit it the hardest. There were geologists, physicists, and a motley handful of anthropologists who researched in the halls and codices, but had I not come here, I would not have been spared the horror of watching teachers turning on students, lovers attacking each other in the night, and people taking their own lives as if all Mars had regressed to the relaxed complacency of old Earth. We came here because Earth could no longer sustain us. It had been centuries. Majid Tubi, the Hashu of the Quilombo of Angola, told me when I first began interviewing him. The seat of the Hashu traced back to an ancient Maya culture on Earth. Here, they were not only medical and herbal support, but they were also Rio, who held the histories and the pulse of the Quilombos they served. The Angolans' memories are those of the soil, Hashu Tupi said. His hair, though stretching from thin patches on top, draped over his lab coat to his buttocks in a thick braid. He adjusted his tie as he said, "The memories of Mars himself are woven into my soul." The first generation on Mars lamented beneath the moonless sky, realizing too late that the moon had greater influence over human reproduction than conventional science knew enough to deny. But the second generation was born nonetheless, only to discover that 669 day cycles was too long to wait for your next birthday, and that staying young for so long made you old very quickly. So the third generation put away childish things, but what was important remained. The heart of each of the cultures that had settled here persisted, and above everything, that collective heart bled the samba. No ephemeris today? Bahia, the Hashu's daughter, asked, noticing that for the first time, I was not scrawling notes with my stylus. You rely on that thing too much, she added. It is my work. I watch people's lives and I write about them. Can you write about life and live it at the same time? She smiled as she moved away from the harda, closer to me, and began swaying her hips softly to the rhythm. It was difficult to answer, but just 6 days before, I had been comforted by the distance the small data unit put between me and the medical attendant, who told me about a man from Charshambe who had awakened in the middle of the night with his wife standing expressionless at the head of the bed, a red silk kitchen knife in one hand and a severed penis in the other. So many eyes. They see us. All of us, the woman had said before throwing herself throat first onto the knife. The attendant said they'd saved the man's life, but his mind was gone before he got there. It is easy to see that hell is full, the Hashu had said. That is why we had originally looked to Mars. The day I arrived at the Hashu's home, a man visiting relatives in Angola stopped by claiming he had seen visions of terrible angels, six-winged and horrible to behold. He said the light from them made your soul forget your body. He admitted to the Hashu they existed only in his head, but he insisted they were very real nonetheless. The Hashu gave the man a mild sedative and sent him home. The next day, he drove a construction maglev into the side of the only school in Chiapas. This was the brand of misery that came with the bloating in the night sky. The ephemeral menace was at once more palpable, and yet less real, than the malandrajum, those who danced and competed in the Hardo spoke of, the malicious intent used to take apart your opponent, to extract life and power from a dead rock, to grow plants without direct sunlight in soil that had never received the nutrients the dead gave back to the living. "Do you dance?" she asked. "My head is much too egg-shaped to enjoy the music the same as you." I smiled. The people of Angola, Iquilombo just south of Arcia Mons, lived and breathed music as if samba rhythms pumped from the atmospheric processor that rose from the Arcia Casmata north of the township. "You think too much," she said. "The thoughts in your head tell your feet to move too many directions. There is nothing to think about. There's only what you feel." She took my hand and motioned me toward the teeming Hardo before us. The third generation saw great prosperity due to the colonial war. Warships docked at the orbital elevator when it still stretched out to the stars. No one lived on the surface then, and the unabated radiation from the sun melted away many of the preconceptions that had existed on Earth, but elevated some of the visceral needs of the cultures that had arrived here. The Colombo of Bahia was established at this time by the Yinhanje, who came to Mars originally to handle the processing of unicreds that filtered in from Earth, and to convert them to the newly found Mars units. Martians were exempt from the Unified Nations draft, and many soldiers never made it back from furlough. Perhaps it was Martian resistance to the destruction elsewhere in the galaxy, but it was this generation that unified the main codices and built the arcology of sciences. The beat became more fervent, and the spinning, looping, kicking malandrus moved into the center of the Hardo. They fainted, spun, and looped to the rhythm of the music. Kicks glanced opponents. Fallen malandrus rolled into counters. Elbows stopped short of sure marks. It was a wonderful display of skill and aggression. She was fascinated by the game, and she pulled me closer to the Hardo and smiled at me as I got a clearer view of the participants. The malandru players would come out every third and seventh day. They usually preferred takedowns. They usually slowed their feet just before the contact. They avoided elbows, opened hands before they contacted, but given the stressors of Martian life, things sometimes escalated. There were frequent brawls from some sort of dispute over rules, or a call, or someone cheating. For one of these brawls to end in a stabbing was not unheard of, but there were no blows exchanged today that were not within the confines of competition. Everyone was smiles, arguments were short-lived, and disputes were solved with handshakes and hugs. It should have been odd, given the strange foreboding shapes looming in the night sky. When she took my hand, I noticed hers was not as soft as it looked like it should have been. It reminded me of something her father had said when I first interviewed him. The sole of the dancer's foot, the palm of the miner's hand, the knuckles of the warrior are all hardened to bring beauty, to salvage power, to save lives in a world that denies life. Every callus is a refusal to lie over and die. The fourth generation saw the final completion of the atmospheric processors, and they rolled back the hermetic louvers that kept the third generation underground. Resources from Earth helped them jumpstart the core, and many of the volcanoes became active again, bringing warmth to various regions of the surface. All in the same process, they found a wealth of liquid water that had been trapped in underground pockets and had not sublimated. The academics later called this the suscitation period, but the Hashus and Jains called it samsara, and it seems they meant all the nuances of the word. Mars was no longer a colony. Even the eggheads could not deny it. And we didn't need missiles or extraplanetary lasers. Our independence was won with water and air and arable soil. Here, you possessed malandrajam, or you died. Everyone you saw walking had a certain amount of malice. That is why the favorite game of the Quilombos was a fight. But to the Malandru, the strongest, the most robust, was the one who could best his opponents with cunning, with craft. One who could match the destructive energy without destroying. That Malandru was the most fearful, the true Quilombo champion, the one who was so frighteningly effective he could use his fists to keep the Quilombo alive. He was like the sun, draining the body of water, burning the skin, promoting cancer, but also the force that brought everything to life with its fury. The bloating in the night sky looked like the atmosphere itself suddenly realized it did not belong here. 4 days before we traveled to Charsambe in the Tarsus region, Hashu Tupi remarked that the lights and strange movement of the stars in the sky was portentous. 2 days later, a woman was brought to him claiming she was one of the forgotten gods. She said she was one of the original masters of the universe, and when he attempted to counsel her and give her a tincture, she bit off his pinky. The devil doesn't need to claim souls anymore. All he needs to do is to make good people miserable, he said, looking to the sky as he rubbed the bandage where his pinky should have been. When you focus on misery, when you stop doing what you like, when you revile life itself, the devil wins. This is why we must feast and dance. Without looking from the sky, he added, there will be no losers in the Hoda tonight. For a moment, the drums stopped, and the berimbau sang its tune. Its haunting twang jovially mocked the human voice. Everyone in the Hoda paused, paying respects to the song's lament. Her coarse brown hair and caramel skin was a beautiful contrast to my own reddish hair and pallid tone. Apparently on Earth, people had separated themselves by the tint of their skin. There were great logs on this in the codex, but many of the books of this type had been relegated to the archival decks. Accents from the various quilombos were unique, but it was the different scents and odors that indicated a person's quilombo better than anything about his or her visual appearance. The smell of brine from the water treatment plants at the Olympus Rupus gas vent, the slight hint of feces and topsoil from the agrarian Amazonas, the tinge of ozone from the Arcia atmosphere processors, all lingered in the clothes, subtle remnants of home carried in the hair and skin. Each quilombo had its own personality, but everyone on Mars knew that they needed everyone else. The Shudras that ran the industry could not function without the mine workers in the favelas and the Suchi beneath the surface. The miners could not function without the agrarians who managed the terrariums and the grazers, and the terrariums did not work without the Mars creds the Yinhangjia managed. Preconceptions had very little use on Mars. Maybe that's why over time we forgot the generalizations in lieu of the specifics. The Hudas determined how the Quilombos treated each other, and when voices rose and tempers flared, the Hudas also determined who went home in respectful silence. Exosuits were a necessary inconvenience in the spring to shield against the frosty Martian air. Rarely, and only during the short Martian summers, could even a wetsuit protect you from the frigid river temperatures. Yet a day before coming to the Tarsus, I watched a woman by the river repeatedly submerging a child. He was bigger than a toddler, but too small to be a teen. She pushed his head beneath the water gently and without violence, even though the shivering child was tearing at her face. There was an ominous hole where the eye could see should have been. She was covered in red, but she continued to lower him into the water, begging softly between sobs for the Mother of God to pray for her in the hour of death. The horns came out, and they moved to Bossa Nova and Samba Reggae, and the Malandrus receded from the Horda to give way to the general crowd. Bahia pulled me even closer to the Horda to fill in a gap, but I stopped. You must dance, she said. It sounded like a demand, but it felt like a plea. I will. I sincerely wanted to, but the energy of the Horo was building. The smell of the music, the scent of sweat and saliva and soil that had been lived on, pulsed in and out of the Hoda, and honestly, it was frightening. The fifth generation saw weakness in a disease the Hashus thought was created by telluric energies generated after the core burned and spun again. They believed that through the previous generations, the body had forgotten how to handle the energy of a live planet. This epidemic made many ill, even killed a few, but it also made the Hodas bigger, the Samba became fiercer, and the Quilombos were the closest they would be in all of Martian history. That is, before now. They also saw the end of contact with Earth. They assumed the war had ended, and that somehow, inconceivably, Earth had lost. They aimed signals directly at Earth, but the signals only bounced back unanswered, echoing any dying hopes of returning home. They eventually took down the orbital elevator, because after Earth stopped sending levies, we needed the building materials more than we needed a space station. For a full century after the fifth generation, and then another, and yet another, the Martians toiled, found adversity, but survived and found progress. Can we go higher? She asked. The Ashe and the Bharatanatyam looked so much better from above. I nodded, but this time I took her hand, and we moved to the mountain behind the Hodas as the music followed us up. The Ashe troops entered the Hoda. They competed as well, but where the Melandru's conditioning and cunning determined victory, the Ashe was won by pleasing the crowd. Their movements were animated and choreographed, and often mimicked the melody or singing. Each troop hurled themselves into the air, or added complicated ground movements to sway the attentions of the onlooker. Hashu Tupi told me many of the more spectacular moves were particularly Martian inventions. The Hashu smiled widely when he spoke of the Ashe. When I was much younger, the Ashe that lives in my heart could still find its way to my hands and feet. Now it tends to stay here and here. He first pointed to his forehead, and then, oddly, to his midsection, before he continued. The history of the Ashe is a rich one. It has developed greatly since the days on Earth, and has become as robust as the Melandro games. Unfortunately, many of the Quilombos have become more invested in the outcomes than in the execution. But such is the way with Mars. The intensity that keeps us alive must manifest somewhere. The Hoda settles the disputes, survival instinct cannot. Outside of the underground confines of academia, Heidegger still made sense, but was much harder to quote in casual conversation. Even Comte and Mannheim came to mind much less when among the people they inspired us to study. The earth-worn traditions of the Aryan, of Brazil, of Quiche, of Uskav, of Kitoa, of Guangdong, of Jainism, these were on the minds and tongues of patriarchs and matriarchs of the Quilombo. It was as if, through the generations, the wheat was separated from the chaff, but the chaff was what now sustained us, even from the very beginning. Father thinks highly of you, she said. He says you know a great deal about the Martian history and people. How people move, how they talk, and why have always been so interesting to me. The music had risen in fervor, and I had to move my ear close enough to feel her breath shifting the hairs on the side of my face just to hear. Do you ever just stop and sit with them? The people you watch? She asked, and then turned to face me. Of course. I visit with elders. I speak with the scholars and the keepers of the codices. How could I learn without them? She seemed amused by my answer. You remind me of something my father asked once. He asked, why are there so few mirrors on Mars? Because silica is harder to come by than it was on Earth, and it is more important to industry? I expected you would have an answer like that. I said something like that too, thinking I was clever. She smiled and wrapped her arms around herself. My father said, it's because we don't need mirrors to see ourselves here. This time I was amused. My roommate at the arcology was both surprised and overjoyed that I have a mirror. Is your roommate also studying to hide in the shadows and watch people? The comment should have been snide, but coming from her, it was as warm and soft as the forearm she brushed against mine as the crowd cheered for the victorious Quilombo. After the third day on the Tarsus, the dust was making my hair coarse, and it had become unimaginably kinky. The Hashu heard I wanted to cut my hair, and he personally came to my tent to stop me. The hair holds the memories of its host, he said. Warriors of ancient earth were known for their long hair, wise men for their beards. There was a time, after life presented unavoidable change, people were inclined to cut their hair short, he explained. When entering the military, the idea was uniformity, but leaving the shavings on the floor also represented your transcendence from individual to collective. The word transcendence was an interesting choice, but it made more sense the further I traveled from the archaeology. As we sat on the mound, Janes from Nardu, the agrarian Quilombo in the midst of the Amazonia quadrangle, entered the center Hoda in festive regalia. The smaller Hodas dissolved as the center Hodas swelled around the Nardus. It was fascinating how over the centuries they had adapted movements for the Bharatanatyam to the music of Mars. The Jains often kept to themselves, openly opposing some of the behaviors of the Melandrus, but today the Hoda opened for them, and they brought one of their own, the newest and brightest student in Nardu, not to battle, but to showcase her learning in an orangutan. Father says orangutan means climbing the stage, she said, as she intently watched the wide, precise movements that drew crisp circles in the Martian air. It feels like today we are all climbing with her. I looked away for a moment at the stars. She smelled of lavender and chamomile, some of the more rejuvenative herbs cultivated in the Hashu's terrarium. She preferred those herbs to the ipecac, opium, and peyote her father specialized in. Bahia ran her fingers through my hair as the horns and guitar danced around the offbeat. I had not noticed how she looked at me until now. It was like the ephemeris blocked her gaze. It was as if she saw something behind me, something I refused to believe was there. I had come here to study them, but she had looked into me. One of the Nardus told me the dance is dedicated to Lord Ganesha, who removes all obstacles. He symbolizes a new beginning. I could hear her words, and I felt the music, but I could not look away from the growing light and the stars. What looked like two fishes in the sky stretched from a point below a distant star, forming the head of a ghostly spear. The air continued to get colder. I grabbed Bahia's hand and sidled closer to her. I could feel her cheek press into my shoulder, and I knew she was smiling, but I selfishly hoped it was for me. After the Jains left the Hoda, the lilt of the pagoji filled the air, and couples moved with a particular necessity to the center of the gathering. It must have been the strange lights in the sky, which were building now to the point where the light they cast reached the ground. We had survived too long to let the life we loved so much run us down. Whatever was between us and the stars had arrested our minds, but it could not take our hearts. Inside the Hoda, whatever style, from whatever Quilombo, the Melandru and the samba dancer was free, but I had never danced. Until today. I pulled her toward the center of the Hoda as the intensity of the lights threatened to drive away the night. The light cast a strange but alluring orange glow on Bahia's face and left a beryline aster in her dark irises. It was like the hand of a wraith reaching down from the sky. But here, this night, that spectral hand could not reach us. The drums were too loud. Humanity was alive and coate and strong, and our bodies moved too fast for it to catch. The light shifted from orange to yellow and should have been blistering, but it felt as if the air itself was draining the heat from our bodies upward. I've always wanted to take your hand, to pull you close to me, to make love to you, but I was too busy to notice you felt the same, I said to her, pulling her close to me. I could feel her heart beating against my stomach. But you've noticed now when it matters the most. A tear escaped her eye, but did not run down her cheek. I kissed her then, long and deep, for all the kisses I had been too studious to give. And at some point, before our lips finally parted, the light had vanished, and the night sky forced us to look up. Only it was no longer the night sky. The light had focused into a point at the center of the spearhead, and the stars danced impossibly around the outline of the spear. It looked as if the sky itself was being drawn into that insidious point. We had survived everything, but we would not survive this. "Do you think whatever silenced Earth is up there?" she asked. She tried to smile, but trembled. "I think Earth's problems were too loud, too wordy." I looked back to the jasper shimmer in her eyes. "Whatever is up there has not bothered to communicate. If it wants us dead, it wants just that. No more, no less." I tried to pull her closer to me, into me, and we kissed again, longer this time. That was when the world became silent, blurry. The music was gone, and only the warmth of Bahia's body and the scent of lavender, of sweat, and of longing remained. This is how the world ends. And here we are all together. We made it easy for them, I said quietly, and was surprised she heard. All together, we made it impossible. There are no losers in the heart of tonight. I pulled her in again, until the beating of our hearts melted into one droning whir that matched the only sound left in the universe. As we kissed one last time, I closed my eyes, and I saw the stars fall. It was beautiful. Thank you, and hope you enjoyed listening to Bahia. This vidcast sampler was narrated by the author, Ashanti Luke, and produced by Kaiju Publishing. The theme music, Stay, is performed by Hungry Lucy and is used with permission. You can find out more about the musical group at their website, hungrylucy.com. Dusk is currently available at all major e-bookstores. Nightfall is due for release in late April of 2014.